Before you ever opened your eyes, the blueprint of your life may have already been carved into your blood, etched not by your will, but by generations who treated human legacy like a sacred ritual, and genetics like property to be guarded. This wasn't destiny or chance. It was a silent inheritance, locked in before breath or thought, passed down by ancestors who saw love as secondary to lineage and believed that controlling blood was equal to controlling fate. Picture being born into a legacy so tightly wound that it leaves no room for divergence, where your face, your voice, even your ailments are reflections of centuries-old choices made in candlelit rooms filled with fear, power, and pride. These weren't families, they were echo chambers, where the same blood cycled through the same bodies, where marriages were made not for connection but preservation, and where individuality was slowly exiled in the name of loyalty to a name. In those lineages, portraits hung like mirrors, each generation staring back with nearly identical eyes, lost in a loop of inherited ambition and unspoken despair. Across eras and empires, beneath the gold and marble, a dangerous myth grew roots, that purity brings strength. But what it brought instead was collapse, spines bent under repetition, minds cracked by genetic pressure, and children born into cages they couldn't see. These are not just the stories of nobility, they are intimate philosophical tragedies. Evidence of what happens when the fear of dilution outweighs the value of variation. And as we unfold the lives shaped by this obsession, one question emerges, heavier with each name, not how they fell, but why they kept climbing, even as the structure rotted beneath them. Among the earliest women tangled in this blood-stained inheritance was a queen born not into freedom, but into a lineage already collapsing under its own design. Her arrival was praised as a continuation of legacy, a triumph of succession, but beneath the gilded smiles and royal fanfare, her birth marked yet another turning of a dangerous wheel. Her palace, though draped in silk and silence, was more of a genetic maze than a home. Her mother was her father's niece, a bond wrapped in both political convenience and biological peril. Their union wasn't just controversial, it defied the balance nature relies on to protect life from internal collapse. Her body, delicate from the start, seemed to carry the weight of ancestral insistence. Fragile bones, an immune system weakened by repetition, a nervous system prone to the storms of inherited strain. And her mind, brilliant at moments, but often adrift, reflected the quiet chaos encoded in her very cells. Her grandparents mirrored each other so closely that her family tree barely branched, it looped like a ring of mirrors facing inward. When she bore children, the hope was for new beginnings, but the pattern repeated. Several slipped away before the world could even call their names. And the ones who lived, history holds its breath here, because doubts began to fester. Whispers grew into suspicions that the men seated beside her, her royal consort, may have had no part in their creation. Whether by necessity, arrangement, or unspoken despair, her womb became both a continuation and a rebellion. And so behind the parades, behind every embroidered gown and ceremonial decree, there was always something breaking. A crown gleaming with the weight of too many buried truths. A woman trapped in the shape of tradition, left to rule over a kingdom of silent consequences. The descent spiraled further with a young empress whose future was sealed not by affection, but by strategy. She wasn't married, she was exchanged, handed over like a signed treaty sealed with skin. The men she was bound to had once worn the face of an enemy to her homeland, and now, by decree, he was to share her bed, her throne, her bloodline. Her lineage, when traced, defies the natural order, less like a branching tree and more like a noose tightening with every generation. The same ancestors repeated, reappearing across her bloodline like ghosts refusing to leave. Her family had folded into itself so many times that the concept of newness was almost extinct. She bore the weight of an empire desperate for stability and the unspoken horror of a genetic inheritance destined to echo forever. Modern science now unravels what her body already knew. She had only half the genetic diversity of an ordinary human, just 4 unique great-grandparents instead of 8. This isn't poetic exaggeration. It's the kind of biological contraction found in remote, endangered animal populations, where isolation chokes the genome and variation withers to dust. Within her cells, something vital had quietly eroded, the raw possibility of difference. Not just physical health, but spiritual direction. Her life was not carved from desire, it was a ritual reenactment of old decisions made by men who saw women as vessels of dynasty. Her fate had been sewn together decades before she was born, and by the time she was dressed for coronation, her freedom was already a fossil. She didn't just inherit a crown, she inherited a script, written in the narrow ink of genetic repetition, where love was irrelevant and duty bled into design. From the crumbling elegance of old-world empires to the hushed, dust-thick air of a modern American backroad, the same unsettling rhythm beats on. The story morphs, but the essence stays, the tragedy of bloodlines turned inwards. In a quiet town, far removed from the grandeur of marble corridors, a woman lived not in luxury, but in the long shadow of generational collapse. Her lineage wasn't charted across kingdoms but traced through living rooms and shared last names. These weren't unions forged for peace or empire, they were forged in isolation, repetition, and silence. Her son, now observed by researchers with both awe and sorrow, walks the earth as perhaps the most visibly affected result of unbroken familial entanglement. But he doesn't carry his inheritance with guilt, he carries it with presence. His very existence is a testimony, a biological artifact reminding us what happens when humanity ignores the quiet laws of balance written into nature itself. No titles, no thrones, no coronations. Just a family that slowly sealed itself off from the outside world until there was nowhere left to turn but inward. And the consequences didn't roar. They whispered. They showed up in posture, in speech, in gaze. This is not a relic buried in ancient tombs, it's a breathing, blinking proof that the past never truly dies. It only changes its costume, slips into newer skin, and continues to echo through the forgotten corners of the present. To some, she was remembered as devout. To others, she was the embodiment of unraveling, hailed as the pious by those who clung to appearances, whispered about as the broken by those who witnessed her decline. She was born into a dynasty where marrying your cousin wasn't scandal, it was standard. In that world, love bowed to lineage, and duty sharpened its edge against the human heart. Her fate wasn't hers to shape. She was commanded, softly, solemnly, to marry her uncle, as though bloodlines were sacred scripture and deviation a sin. From that decision flowed a chain of quiet sorrows. She gave birth, yes, but the cradle often became a coffin before names were ever spoken aloud. The ones who survived bore their own shadows, but it was the losses that hollowed her. Her spirit, once strong, began to fold inward. Her thoughts drifted, her presence dimmed, and the corridors of her mind stretched into a maze she could no longer navigate. Eventually, she was no longer seen as a ruler, but as something fragile, too delicate for command, too haunted to guide. She wasn't overthrown by rebels or betrayed by allies. Instead, her undoing came from within. Biology, warped by generations of repetition, had quietly unstitched the fabric of her being, thread by thread. And in the end, she didn't fall. She simply faded. Draped in the elegance of French aristocracy, she lived not in a fairy tale, but in a slow, poetic collapse disguised as royalty. Her blood was already entangled before she took her first breath, born to cousins who saw union as duty, not danger. Her future wasn't shaped by dreams or choice, but by a quiet arrangement inked in family trees and closed doors. Still a girl, she was married off to yet another relative, as if the family name could only survive by circling back on itself. Her womb became a vessel for expectation, but what followed was only silence, child after child lost before laughter could ever fill their rooms. The mourning never ended, it only changed form. She turned to drink before she had even turned fully into a woman. Not for rebellion, but as an escape from the life she had no hand in designing. And in that blur of grief and intoxication, something more than children died. Her sense of self, her voice, her very possibility was slowly erased. She didn't just lose heirs, she lost the right to imagine herself outside the lineage that consumed her. In trying to preserve the prestige of her bloodline, her family unknowingly buried the living parts of her soul. She became a monument to sorrow dressed in velvet, her body a mausoleum for choices she never made. In an era when the world was beginning to forget the language of crowns, she was born, a princess not of promise, but of preservation. Her birth in the mid-20th century was less a celebration of new life and more a desperate attempt to stitch together the unraveling threads of fading empires. Her parents, entwined not once but twice in the quiet mathematics of consanguinity, were bound by bloodlines that refused to die with dignity. Second cousins. Third cousins. Their union was not romantic, it was strategic, a final gamble to merge two waning dynasties into something that could withstand modernity's indifference. But their legacy did not strengthen. It folded inward once more, compounding old fragilities with new expectations. She grew up wearing the mask of nobility, her posture trained, her smile rehearsed. But her very features betrayed the weight of inherited closeness, a face that seemed drawn from the same ancestral palette used too many times. Her genes whispered secrets her lips never spoke, stories of great-grandparents who were also great-uncles, of dynastic repetition disguised as tradition. She wasn't a symbol of evolution. She was a soft echo of a past that refused to release its grip. Her legacy shimmered with prestige, but the foundation cracked quietly beneath it. She stood, unknowingly, at the crossroads of pageantry and entropy, a living contradiction in silk gloves, carrying a name too old to breathe in the present tense. And then came the one history barely bothers to name, a woman so entangled in the knots of her own ancestry that her existence became more myth than memory. Overshadowed by louder, more dramatic figures in her bloodline, she slipped through the cracks of historical narrative, yet her body carried a genetic riddle so extreme it silenced modern scientists. She did not descend from a family tree, she emerged from a closed loop, a recursive spiral where names repeated like a curse no one dared break. Her bloodline didn't branch, it coiled, wrapped tightly around itself until identity became repetition and lineage turned into a mirror reflecting the same faces again and again. Her DNA, when mapped, revealed a haunting symmetry, so condensed, so collapsed, it resembled the child of two direct siblings. She was not the product of sin, but of centuries of obsession, an obsession with keeping power sealed within walls too narrow to sustain life without consequence. The dynasty that created her believed itself sacred, almost celestial, yet could not comprehend the quiet punishment encoded into their inheritance. While history has chosen to look past her, science cannot forget. She has become a silent monument, an unspoken ending to a royal bloodline that thought it could defy nature by outlasting it. She is not remembered for her words or her deeds, but her very cells remain a whisper of warning, echoing the truth no crown can hide, that divinity forged in repetition always decays from within. Centuries before science could name the damage, beneath the relentless sun of ancient Egypt, a dynasty had already surrendered to a belief so consuming it blurred the line between sacred order and genetic collapse. Buried beneath the dust of forgotten rituals, two infant girls were found, wrapped not only in linen but in the tragedy of divine ambition. They never cried, never took a step, never saw the golden light of the Nile. Their lives ended before they began, sealed in silence and ritual, mummified as offerings to a bloodline that mistook proximity for purity. Their parents were not just royals, they were siblings, joined in both blood and belief, carrying forward a long chain of unions forged under the illusion that gods walked within their veins. Their father, remembered across time as the boy king, was himself a creation of ancestral repetition, a body molded by years of closed-circle reproduction, a ruler raised not by wisdom but by the quiet erosion of genetic possibility. The daughters they bore into this sacred lineage never stood a chance. Their bones, now studied and scanned, carried the deformities of generations who believed that keeping the throne in the family was more important than preserving the integrity of life itself. No tomb inscription admits to the cost. No hieroglyph dares whisper the truth. But their remains tell a different story, a story not of glory, but of a civilization so obsessed with divine continuity that it traded the miracle of life for a legacy carved in stone and sorrow. In the shadowed edges of modern civilization, far from thrones and titles, a girl emerged from the quiet wilderness of Australia, not wrapped in royal fabric, but in something far more chilling, obscurity bred into a legacy of silence. Her family, nestled deep within the hills, had vanished from the world, not geographically, but mentally. The map ended at their fence line, and beyond it, time no longer moved. Inside the closed circuit of survival and denial, the bloodlines coiled inward for decades, brothers with sisters, uncles with nieces, forming unions not for power or pride, but because the outside world had faded from memory like a forgotten dream. No politics, no purpose, just routine born of isolation, repeating itself until trauma became tradition. When the veil was finally lifted, even hardened authorities stood stunned. The children were pale echoes of a world they'd never seen, lacking not just knowledge, but language, orientation, and identity. The adults moved through life carrying broken histories inside them, shaped not by love but by psychological confinement passed down like a family heirloom. And at the heart of it all stood this girl, her presence almost ghost-like, her DNA etched with the heavy imprint of a lineage turned inward so violently it fractured the very blueprint of being. She wasn't a relic of the past, she was a living monument to what happens when humanity forgets itself, when a family becomes a closed loop, and the echoes of pain become louder than the call of the world beyond. And then there is the final figure, the one who doesn't just represent the tragedy of bloodline obsession, but who embodies its full philosophical collapse. Not the romanticized queen of myth and cinema, but Cleopatra II, a woman born not into royalty, but into ritual. Her dynasty wasn't ruled by strategy or sentiment, it was governed by a doctrine as rigid as scripture, that power must never leave the family, no matter the cost. Her parents were siblings. So were her grandparents. And as if repeating a sacred chant, she continued the cycle, ruling beside brothers who were also her husbands, blending roles until even language could no longer separate kinship from marriage. This was never love. It was legacy embalmed. A closed circuit of inheritance, sealed off from the world, fueled by the belief that divinity ran purest when it remained unaltered. But in that refusal to evolve, something began to die. Her power was immense, yes, but it came tied to a body carrying the burden of genetic suffocation, and a mind shaped by generations of confinement disguised as destiny. The dynasty to which she belonged saw purity as strength, but what they created was a lineage so inward-facing that it eventually disappeared under the weight of its own illusion. She ruled from a throne carved of repetition, in a palace echoing with the voices of ancestors who had all said the same thing, keep it in the blood. But nature, unlike human pride, demands balance. And in the end, even her empire, once seen as divine, faded into dust, leaving behind a name, a myth, and a caution etched into the human record that no structure, no crown, no lineage can survive when it refuses the gift of change. These aren't merely biographies, they're warnings etched in flesh. They're not just individual tragedies, but recurring symbols of a deeper human flaw, the illusion that perfection is found in sameness. Beneath crowns, behind curtains, and within quiet villages, a singular thought took root, that purity is protection, that blood unblended is somehow divine. But worshipping sameness is not devotion, it is destruction in slow motion. It is the closing of doors until there is no air left to breathe. This is no longer just history, it's philosophy made manifest. It's what happens when the idea of legacy transforms into a metaphysical prison, where continuity is mistaken for strength, and tradition becomes a ritual of slow collapse. The belief that preserving the past is more vital than embracing the unknown doesn't just stifle, it suffocates. And it always ends in the same hushed catastrophe, with minds unraveling, bodies breaking under invisible weights, and lineages vanishing into themselves, terrified of change until change becomes impossible. The pursuit of purity, in its most fanatical form, becomes a self-erasing act, a devotion so blind that it annihilates the very thing it sought to protect. In the end, history doesn't just remember these women, it grieves them. Not for their titles or their tragedies alone, but for the quiet violence embedded in the choices they never got to make. They were carved not from ambition, but from expectation, shaped by the hands of others, by dynasties and doctrines, by bloodlines more concerned with echo than evolution. From palace halls to forgotten corners of the earth, they carried the same silent inheritance, sorrow passed down like jewelry, like duty, like fate. Some wore crowns, others anonymity, but all of them bore the weight of a legacy that valued continuity over humanity. They were mothers of stillborn hope, daughters of closed-door decisions, vessels in a ritual of preservation that called itself noble. And as we look back, their lives force us to confront a deeper question: is nobility measured by how tightly we cling to identity, or by the bravery to release it? The devastation they endured wasn't accidental. It was constructed, institutionalized, even sanctified. Their suffering was written into the script of tradition and performed across generations like a sacred play. That is the true heartbreak, not that they were broken, but that they were broken on purpose and called eternal for it. And so the past lingers, not in loud declarations, but in the quiet ache of fractured crowns, in bones buried beneath centuries of silence, in portraits where the same eyes repeat endlessly. It whispers through the dust of dynasties and the decay of once sacred bloodlines: beware the lineage that rejects evolution. Beware the family that walls itself in, mistaking repetition for resilience. For in its desperate hunger to be eternal, it forgets how to be present. In trying to escape death, it drains the life from its own future. These weren't just families, they were systems built to mirror themselves forever. But what never bends, eventually breaks. And the legacy that refuses to let new blood in doesn't become immortal, it becomes a tomb sealed by its own fear. What remains is not strength, but a monument to stagnation. Not a triumph, but a slow, elegant extinction carved in gold.